Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is episode 9, titled Why Engaging Your Story Requires Anger at God. This is an important topic. If you're living an honest life, I don't know how you can escape feeling anger at God. So let's dive straight in. Thank you so much for listening. One of the places we find ourselves is the place of anger. We often find ourselves in a place of being angry. Actually, that's only true for some of us. Others of us have grown up in Christian cultures in which it was flat out wrong to feel anger at God. It was wrong to ever feel abandoned by God or to ever feel a sense of disappointment in God. And so if we ever found ourselves feeling even the littlest bit of abandonment by God or anger at God or disappointment in God, we would promptly nip that feeling in the bud because we believed it was somehow ungodly or wrong to feel it. Many Christians feel ashamed of the real anger that they have at God buried underneath the surface. They feel ashamed of any feelings of abandonment by God. You may be terrified of the thought of feeling anger at God, just feeling it, much less expressing it. But if you have somehow overcome the nonsense that it's somehow ungodly or prideful to be angry at God, then the anger that actually resides in your heart will have the freedom to bubble up. And as you engage the heartache and the pain of your story, there will invariably be times when you do feel abandoned by God, and that generates some sense of anger. You might feel abandoned by God in a particular moment in your story. Or it may be just this general sense of, God, how could you have let me be sexually abused? Why didn't you prevent it? Why didn't you have me move into a different neighborhood so that the boy who abused me would never have been in my life? Would that have been so hard, God, for you to have me live in a slightly different neighborhood? Or why didn't you let my dad keep his job so that he didn't become an alcoholic after he got fired and was unemployed for 2 years? Would that have been so difficult? Would that have shifted history so much? Or you might not feel a sense of abandonment by God merely in the past, but you may feel abandoned by God now in the present as you try to heal from those things that have harmed your heart. And you find that your efforts at healing don't seem to be working, and you have this sense of God abandoning you in the present as your healer. I have personally had a great deal of anger at God and still do in many ways. And as a pastor, as a counselor, I can tell you that sooner or later, if you are emotionally honest, you will feel anger toward God. What I'd like to suggest is that very often one's anger at God is actually a result of how important God is to you. It's evidence of your holiness, of your faithfulness to God. But we'll get there. First, as we explore this topic, I'd like to use the words of a man named Job. Job is a character in the Bible who lost his children, his wealth, and his health all in one fell swoop, and he is furious at God for taking it all away. And in Job 9 and 10, we have recorded one of his speeches at God. And in this prayer, in this speech that he makes to God, there are several expressions of the depth of his rage. And I am going to read select verses from Job 9 to 10. Here it is. And Job spoke out, and he said, "Of course, I knew it was so. How can man be right before God? Should a person bring grievance against him, he will not answer 1 of 1,000. Who can argue with him and come out whole? Look, he passes over me, and I do not see him. slips by me and I cannot grasp him. Look, he seizes me. Who can resist him? And yet, as for me, I would answer him. I would choose my words with him. Though in the right, I can't make my plea. I would have to entreat my own judge. Should I call out and he answer me, I would not trust him to heed my voice. Who for a hair would crush me and make my wounds many for naught. Though in the right, my mouth will convict me. I am blameless, yet he makes me crooked. And on to Job 10. My whole being loathes my life. Let me give vent to my lament. Let me speak when my being is bitter. I shall say to God, do not convict me. Inform me why you accuse me. Is it good for you to oppress, to despise your own palm's labor? Your hands fashioned me and made me, and then you turned round and destroy me. Like a triumphant lion, you hunt me. You summon new witnesses against me and swell up your anger toward me. My days are but few. Let me be. Turn away, that I may have some gladness. Job, chapters 9 and 10. Have you ever given your anger to God? Have you ever just followed Job's footsteps and let God have it? Poured out your anger before you edited it to make it nice? If you haven't, then really the book of Job and so many other portions of the scriptures are an invitation to consider trying it. And if you have, then the book of Job is an affirmation of your courage and indeed of your faithfulness to God. The first thing to notice about Job 9 and 10 is that Job is furious and he's expressing his anger to God. So in chapter 9, verse 3, should a person bring grievance against God, he will not answer one of 1,000. Job is saying you can throw up 1,000 prayers to God, 1,000 grievances, and God won't answer a single one. Anger. Can you relate to this? I sure can. I bring a grievance to God over and over and hear nothing back. And it is the deafening silence that is so disturbing. Verse 11, look, God passes over me, and I do not see him, slips by me, and I cannot grasp him. Look, he seizes me. Who can resist him? Job is saying three things. Number one, I can't see him with my eyes when he walks by me. Number two, I can't grasp him with my hands because he slips by me. And number three, I can't escape when he grasps me. In other words, Job is furious because he's powerless to see God, to grasp God. And then, when God seizes Job, Job can't resist him. Chapter 9, verse 16. Should I call out and God answer me, I would not trust him to heed my voice. In other words, in the unlikely event that God actually answers me, he won't heed my voice. He won't really pay attention to what I say. He won't address what I'm really upset about. And this is the crux of Job's pain. Job wants God to pay attention to him, to his words, to his complaint. And by the way, just as an aside, do you see how core attachment is to the experience of being human? What Job is saying is, God, I need you to respond to me. And he's furious, not primarily, this is so important, he is furious not primarily because he lost his health, his wealth, and his children. He is not primarily furious at the tragedy of his life. He is primarily furious because God will not answer him, will not respond to him, will not engage with him. Attachment. Chapter 9, verse 17, you crush me and make my wounds many for naught. In other words, you wound me over and over, and for no good reason. Verse 20, I am blameless, yet he makes me crooked. Even though I'm right, he will twist my words, and he will make me look wrong. Chapter 10, verse 8, your hands fashioned me and made me, and then you turn round and destroy me. God made Job, and then God just decides to destroy that which he made. That's what Job is saying. And then, like a triumphant lion, you hunt me. Verse 16. It's pretty obvious, and this is just a short selection of Job's anger. Job is livid about his circumstances, and he's giving God his anger. And just so you know, as the book of Job continues, as chapter 10 becomes 11, 15, 20, 30, Job's anger swells rather than decreases. It increases. It goes up. Here's a sampling of Job's anger in the upcoming chapters. You slay me. Write bitter things against me. Destroy my hope. Tear me apart. Shake me to pieces. Rush at me like a warrior. Strip from me my glory. Distance my brothers from me. Scheme against me. Deny me justice. Max Mclean is an actor who has done an audio recording of the entire Bible, and it's a very skillful and meaningful reading of the scriptures. And I want to play now a compilation of Max Mclean's reading of the book of Job, and I have excerpted Job's expressions of anger at God, his accusations against God, his unedited rage at God, and I have put those portions of the text side by side, read by Max Mclean. Here they are.
Why have you made me your mark? The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not he, who then is it? Yet you will plunge me into a pit. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands and favor the designs of the wicked? Your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether. And were my head lifted up, you would hunt me like a lion and again work wonders against me. You renew your witnesses against me, and increase your vexation toward me. You bring fresh troops against me. For you write bitter things against me, and make me inherit the iniquities of my youth. You put my feet in the stocks, and watch all my paths. So you destroy the hope of man. He has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. God gives me up to the ungodly, and casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. Know then that God has put me in the wrong and closed his net about me. He has walled up my way so that I cannot pass, and he has set darkness upon my paths. He has stripped from me my glory, and taken the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone, and my hope has he pulled up like a tree. He has kindled his wrath against me, and counts me as his adversary. His troops come on together. They have cast up their siege ramp against me, and encamp around my tent. He has put my brothers far from me. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me.
So there it is. Job's anger at God, read by Max Mclean. You may be thinking after all of that, hey, just because Job expresses all this anger at God doesn't mean it's good to do that. After all, the scripture is filled with examples of people doing the wrong thing. So just because Job says all this stuff doesn't mean we should. We shouldn't necessarily model ourselves after that. Well, here's the problem with that objection. At the end of the book of Job, in chapter 42, we read the following. The Lord said to Eliphaz, that's one of Job's friends, "My wrath has flared against you and your two companions, because you have not spoken rightly of me, as did my servant Job. And now take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer a burnt offering for yourselves, and Job, my servant, will pray on your behalf. To him only I shall show favor, not to do a vile thing to you, for you have not spoken rightly of me, as did my servant Job." God says twice that Job spoke rightly of him. Now, what in the world can that mean? Is God confessing that he tore Job apart, like Job said, that he rushed at Job like a warrior? No, God is saying it was right for Job to express his anger at me. Job spoke rightly of me in his speech, in his unedited expression of rage. It was right for him to bring his truest heart to me. It was right for him to speak to me unedited. So, point number 1, Job is furious at God. He's expressing his rage to God. He's angrily accusing God. Point number 2 is simply this. Job did not have to do it. He could have suppressed his anger out of fear. It's a frightening thing to yell at God. There's a fear that he's going to be mad at you. And so Job could have stuffed his anger because he was afraid of God. Secondly, he could have suppressed his anger at God by saying to himself, he's God. There's no way to argue with him. He's always right. So there's no point in bringing my grievances to him. Third, Job could have just written God off. But by this I mean that he could have said to himself, God is not going to listen to me, and he's certainly not going to answer. Therefore, I'm not even going to waste my time yelling at him. Job didn't have to take his anger to God. It's a difficult thing to summon the courage to rage at God. The first time I did this, I remember I was a freshman in college, and I remember that when my words finally came to an end, I was in the car, and unedited, I expressed it all to God, and when my words finally came to an end, I sat there and I remember kind of bracing myself for God's retaliatory strike. Part of me was afraid that he was going to just smite me then and there. But here's the thing. God can handle your anger, and he is neither surprised by it, he knows it's in there, nor afraid of it. Job chooses not to ignore his anger. He speaks it. He puts words to his rage. He finds language to express what's really going on inside of him. When you feel like God has let you down, will you allow yourself to feel anger? Just to feel it. When you reflect on your story and you see those moments when you feel abandoned by God, will you let yourself feel your feelings about that? And then, will you have the courage to express to God what you are actually feeling and thinking inside? Next point, it's not merely that God is okay with our anger. He has actually given us help in accessing our anger, in connecting with our anger. Some of you see Job express his anger, you read it, and you resonate with it. Reading Job's words actually stirs up your anger. Or you hear Max Mclean read, and something about those words stirs up your anger. Other people, you see Job express his anger, you read it, and you wish he would just shut up. Reading Job's words scares you because you're not comfortable with your own anger. God has given us the book of Job to help us identify what we are actually feeling. In other words, the reading of Job's words, and especially the saying of them, provide access to our emotion. They help us connect to and access our own anger. So here's the point. God is not merely okay with you expressing anger at him. He actually gives you the words to take your anger to him. He gives you the lines. He writes them for you because he knows that it is difficult to both connect to and express the depth of our anger at him. The book of Job, along with so many other portions of Scripture, is not merely there for us to read. It is there for us to pray the book of Job. We are to take Job's words and pray them to God as if they were our words. Have you ever taken the words of someone like Job or the words of the psalmist and prayed those words to God? Taken them for yourself and said them to God? This is very different than merely reading the text, reading Job, reading the Psalms. Because here's the thing, God knows that ultimately he is the core object of our anger. When we're suffering, our suffering may be caused by another person's harm. It often is. It may be caused by something that someone else did or didn't do. Someone else may be to blame, if you will. But ultimately, God is the one we are angry with. For God is the one who could have prevented it and didn't. God is the one who allowed it to happen like this. God is the one who allowed my story to unfold the way it has. And perhaps worse, God is the one who is apparently silent in the face of our protests. What do you read in God's silence? How do you interpret God's silence in your life? Do you interpret it as, I deserve this? I brought this on myself? I don't merit a response from the Almighty? How do you interpret God's silence in your life? Job does not conclude, I deserve this, or I brought this on myself, or I don't merit a response from God. Nothing of that characterizes Job. Job interprets God's silence as God's failure as a God. So, chapter 9, verse 3, should a person bring grievance against God, God will not answer 1 of 1,000. As you continue to engage your own life story, you are likely going to become angry at God. And the thing that often angers us the most about God is his frequent silence in the moment of our greatest cry. But the Bible invites you to take your anger to God, to give it to him. And look, it's not merely Job that yells at God. The psalmists do it a lot. We see it in the book of Lamentations. In Lamentations 2, the author says, "The Lord is like an enemy." And lest you think this is just an exaggerated metaphor, listen to how it continues into Lamentations 3. This is starting in verse 2. God has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. He has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, he dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. Lamentations 3. Have you ever felt like God has shut out your prayer when you have called out or cried out for help? Have you ever felt like God has made a target out of you? If you have you let these feelings give birth to anger, which in turn gives birth to speech of expressing that anger at God, to God? The psalmist, many places, but just one, Psalm 44, the psalmist writes, God, you no longer go out with our armies. You made us retreat before the enemy. You gave us up to be devoured like sheep. All this happened to us, though we had not forgotten you. Our hearts had not turned back, but you crushed us. You covered us over with deep darkness. Have you ever felt like God has given you up? Like he has crushed you? Like he has covered you over with deep darkness? Do you really think that the writers of Lamentations 2, 3, Psalm 44, Job, that these writers were quietly or politely saying these words to God? I mean, these people are yelling at God. And perhaps most importantly, they are not denying their anger at God. They are allowing the natural emotions of the human heart, living in a world where we often feel abandoned by God or even targeted by God. They are allowing those emotions to exist, to be. To deny anger at God is an odd inclination for people who take the Bible seriously, given the large number of passages where people rage at God. God has put all these expressions of anger at him into the scripture. Why would God have done that? Why would God have put in the scriptures so many examples of people expressing their anger at him? Now, you may be thinking, okay, yeah, there are those passages, but then the text goes on to express trust in God. So in Psalm 13, for example, it begins, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? But then, in verse 5, there is a shift, and the psalmist writes, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. And so you may be thinking, okay, there's an honest expression of anger at God, but then the text always resolves. It always results in an expression of trust in God's faithfulness. Yes, but how much time do you think passed between the writing of verse 1 of Psalm 13 and the writing of verse 5, where there is the shift to, but I trust in your unfailing love? How much time? We think David wrote an entire psalm in one sitting, but anyone who writes poetry or music knows that this rarely happens. What if the place David found himself for an entire year was Psalm 13, verse 1? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? What if that's the place that David found himself for a year, 2 years, 3 years, a decade? We have the completed version of the psalm. We don't have David's journal with dates. We have no idea how much time elapsed while he was in the metaphorical wilderness and valley of verse 1, crying out, how long will you forget me, God? The book of Psalms, Job, Lamentations, these books are crying out to us saying, it's okay to yell at God. It's okay. But we're reluctant. It's common to think, I shouldn't be angry at God. Anger at God shows that I'm rebelling against him rather than trusting him. Who am I, after all, to be angry at the Almighty? The dilemma, of course, is that you can either yell at God or you can keep your anger inside. But no one escapes feeling anger at God. No one makes it through this life without experiencing, without having anger inside at God. You can actually find out a lot about yourself by engaging your anger. Your anger it can be a gift. It will lead you to get to know yourself. C.S. Lewis wrote a fairy tale called Till We Have Faces. Till We Have Faces. And in this fairy tale, the main character feels wronged by the gods, very wronged by the gods, in numerous ways over the course of her life. And at the end of the book, she finally gets an audience with the gods, and she outlines her complaints against them. She yells at them for how they have mistreated her. And when she's finished, she goes through the whole thing again. And then she says this: "The time will come when you at last utter the speech which has lain at the center of your soul for years. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly. How can they meet us face to face till we have faces?" Isn't that beautiful? Let me read that again. The time after she's launched all of her angry speech at the gods and then done it again, she says this: "The time will come when you at last utter the speech which has lain at the center of your soul for years. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly. How can they meet us face to face till we have faces?" Now, what is she saying? Well, C.S. Lewis, thankfully, wrote a letter to a friend in which he explained what he meant by this story. And this is what he said: "The idea was that a human being must become real before it can expect to receive any message from God. That is, it must be speaking with its own voice, expressing its actual desires. How can God meet you face to face? How can he address the core of your heart? Until you have a face, until you bring that speech which has lain at the center of your soul for years to God. Do you know what you're really angry with God about deep down? What is that speech that has lain at the center of your soul for years? Is it that God left you alone? Is it that God really doesn't seem to be there for you? What is your voice? What is your real complaint against God? Maybe one of the reasons we are reluctant to continue looking at the heartache in our story is because we're afraid of what it's going to do to our relationship with God. Perhaps we're afraid, we know intuitively that if we look at the heartache in our story, that this will invariably create conflict between us and God. But how can God meet you face to face until you have a face? May you feel the freedom to find your face and to identify the speech that has lain at the center of your soul. And may you bring that to your God. It is honoring to both you and to him. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Place We Find Ourselves. Please share this podcast with your friends. It will likely stir up some interesting conversation. You can share the episode right now from your device by clicking the circle with the 3 little dots inside it. At least that's how you do it on an iPhone. Also, it would be a huge help if you head over to the iTunes store and write a short review of the podcast. I also have some free resources available that I would love to share with you. You can access those by going to any episode's webpage and looking under free resources. They are marked in red. Thank you to Rick Wilson for providing the music for this podcast. See you next time.